Hello everyone. In this class we're going to take a broad historical view of cities. We'll look at the medieval city, which urbanists often refer to as the walking city, because it couldn't be much larger than an area that you could comfortably walk around in, given that most people didn't have any other mode of transportation other than their feet. And then we'll look at the whole suburbanization story, which starts around 1815. And we'll close the class by looking at the immediate post-World War II period, the phase of suburbanization associated with the automobile, when a lot of people thought the cities were finished. I mean, they figured, gee, if you can have an automobile and live much further out of the city and get away from all its problems with much more space, why would anyone want to live in cities? In this class, we'll see that, and we know that they were partly right and partly wrong. People have thought that way, and we'll consider why they were partly right and why they were partly wrong.
We're going to talk about medieval London. Here's a map showing London in the context of today's England, today's Britain. And here, of course, is medieval London. Now, transportation is key for understanding cities. You can see that London is very much oriented towards the River Thames. Most major cities before suburbanization were on or next to water, rivers, oceans, since water travel was the main mode of transportation, especially between continents. You can also see that London was surrounded by a wall. Most major cities were walled for protection from invaders. This is why you didn't really want to live outside the city. It just wasn't safe. This is a view of London from outside the wall. The original meaning of suburb is underneath or outside the city, and it refers to areas beyond the wall. You can see that the people who lived outside the wall tend to be the less fortunate and often the poorest people. This is a map or an image of Jerusalem, one of the most famous walled cities in history. London and England was continually invaded in the Middle Ages, typically by the Romans. Here's a timeline of some of the major invasions. At one point, the entire population of London just left. I mean, it was too dangerous, and they all moved to the countryside. Just figured it wasn't worth it. It wasn't just the Romans who invaded. The Scandinavians came in on quite a few times and destroyed the place. There was also disease, and clearly people living close together in cities were very vulnerable to disease. For example, one of the best-known epidemics was the Black Death. Pretty much half the population of London died from the Black Death or the plague. There was also fire. Here's an image of the Great Fire of London. The entire city burned down with a fire that started in one bakery, and everything, all the buildings were built of wood, and that was the end of the city. We can basically summarize the features of those pre-suburban cities by talking about the characteristics of walking cities. Walking cities had the following characteristics. They were congested. The city-country distinction was clear. That is, you knew when you'd left the city because you went out the walls and it was countryside. The land use functions were all mixed up together, commercial, residential, and industrial. People typically and often lived above their workplaces. You didn't get the separation that you have in a contemporary suburb of where people live and where they work. Most people had very short distances to go to work. They had to because they didn't really have the transportation to do it any other way. And the most fashionable addresses were in the city centre because that's where you were closest if you were going to walk around. That's where you were closest to most of the major parts of the city that you wanted to be at. Ken Jackson, in the book that you're reading, defines modern suburbanization as basically consisting of two features. The first is that now suddenly, for the first time in the history of cities, the periphery is growing more rapidly than the core. That had never happened before. And second of all, you get this lifestyle involving a daily commute to jobs in the city centre from the periphery. And again, that had never happened before 1815. So it's around 1815 that suddenly things change and you start getting what we consider to be modern suburbanization. Why did it happen? Well, transportation is absolutely key. So that, for example, the early suburbs in New York City were basically triggered by the ferry. What happened was that around 1815, Robert Fulton established a commuter ferry suburb, a commuter ferry. It went from downtown Wall Street, which is where everyone lived at that time, to Brooklyn Heights in Brooklyn. And then entrepreneurs decided to build houses out there. And then people figured, well, if there's a regular ferry, I can live out there. I got more space, and I can take the ferry into work. And so you got the ferry suburb developing in Brooklyn. Something entirely new, people going backwards and forwards every day to work. You also got the omnibus. The omnibus was basically a large carriage pulled by a horse, and it went short distances, for example, up Broadway, which is how Broadway developed. So people figured, well, I can buy a house. If someone will build a house, I can buy a house at the end of the omnibus route because I can take the omnibus to work. And now you get developing a mass transit system. We can define mass transit as follows. It's an operation along a fixed route according to an established standard for a single fare. You get now railroad suburbs developing. And these are the suburbs where people basically live close to a railroad station and take the train into the central city. Railroads originally were for long distance travel, and then it occurred to people, well, why don't we put in short stops? And when they put in short stops, entrepreneurs built houses around there with the hope that people who lived in the city would say, gee, well, I can take the railroad. But all of this was new. People had to learn to take the railroad to work. It wasn't something that came naturally. And then you got streetcar suburbs, which were the electrification, the electric line, which really replaced the omnibus and the horse. And this is an image of New York around 1900. And you can see that things are getting very, very crowded. A lot of different modes of transportation. You've got the steam railroad. They put it on stilts, but it's there. You've got the private carriage, which is what the wealthy always used. And you've got the streetcars, the electric streetcars. It's getting very, very crowded. And now people someone comes up with a brilliant idea right now because everything's getting too crowded. Why don't we put a train underground? An absolutely revolutionary idea. And so the first subway developed. And New York City, after 1900, builds its subway system, as does London. And most of the great cities, they get the same idea at the same time. And subway was the latest idea. Duke Ellington wrote a song, The A Train, which celebrated the fact that he could now get to work in 57th Street, where he played, from Harlem in about 10 minutes, which was on the A Train, which had never been able to do before. Here's London's extensive subway system, tube system as they call it there. Now the characteristic shape of development associated with suburbanization up until the automobile, that is, as we discussed it so far, is what people call hub and spokes. Basically, downtown is the center of the city, it's the hub, and the various modes of transportation go out in spokes, and wherever there's a spoke, people then live and suburbs develop. But downtown is the central key to the whole thing. You now get, after World War II, highways and the auto suburbs developing. The automobile had always been around since 1900, but up until World War II, it was mostly used for recreation. People didn't use it to live in an area that was only accessible by automobiles. After World War II, however, the federal government and Eisenhower, with the 1956 Interstate Highways Act, launched a massive program of highway construction, and now you get developing automobile suburbs. And an automobile suburb, as I've said, is basically somewhere where it's only accessible by automobile. And so now all kinds of areas that hadn't previously been commutable from are now commutable from. Now, the characteristic pattern of urban development with the automobile changes from the hub and spokes to what we call the grid. The grid basically doesn't evolve around a central core, but it's more decentralized, and so you have various nodes along the grid where you have, for example, shopping malls and office development, but there isn't really any more a dominant downtown, or there doesn't have to be. Here's an image of New York's freeway system, and you can see it's more or less a grid. It's not a very tidy grid, but it's more or less a grid. One of the characteristic features of the freeway system as it developed after World War II is that the freeways involved a lot of displacement of residents. In order to build a freeway through a city that is already developed, you have to knock down a lot of people's houses. And that's exactly what happened after World War II. A lot of people got displaced. There were slum clearance programs. It was a very brutal process. It's not something we could do these days, but it's something that was done after World War II. Here's images of people protesting, people being told that in LA that they're going to be evicted, and they do get evicted, and that's just the end of them.